Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is Monday, and we are moving forward towards the midterm. So we want to finish off chapter 3 today and cover any things that we haven't talked about so far. In the last lecture that I posted, there was a few dates and a little bit of timeline things that you have to keep in mind. As I told you, we're doing a cultural studies class, so dates are not something you need to memorize unless I specifically tell you a date. So we do have one date. We do have one date to remember here, which is 1707, which is the date that officially the union that creates the United Kingdom between Scotland and England, and Wales is a part of England, officially creates the United Kingdom. 1707 is that date. So I guess 1066 I mentioned, you need to remember that on the midterm. 1066 is the Norman invasion. 1215 is the Magna Carta, and probably the other dates, it's not going to hurt if you remember them, but mostly I will provide dates for you. That's not really the important part of the course. It's really what happens and how culture develops, not exactly what day or year it happens. However, 1707 is the year that the United Kingdom becomes a country. Previous to that, we have multiple kings. King James first, and then Charles, and then Charles II, and Oliver Cromwell as well, really ruling over Scotland also, and James II, and William, but it's not until Queen Anne becomes the Queen of England that the Union is actually formed. Now, we're going to talk about Scotland. We're going to talk about Scotland first. Going back, all the way back to the Edwards, Scotland really was. It's a very rough. If you look at the end of the chapter, there's some description of Scotland, so you can read this yourself. But let me just explain sort of generally. Scotland is the northern part of the main island. England is the southern part. Just like South Korea and North Korea, the northern part is much more rugged. It's colder. It has some natural resources, but it can't support the same amount of population, and so traditionally it's a poorer part of the island. Just like North Korea can't produce the same amount of rice or products in general, although they might have natural resources that are valuable now. In the past, it was much more difficult to live and survive in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. Likewise, Scotland is the same situation. The Vikings really dominated their culture, especially in the northern parts of Scotland, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And one of the interesting things about Scotland is that if you go to the very far north, that the Viking culture is still present now. But southern Scotland and northern England are almost, could be, they're there's very little difference. I guess it's like Gangwon-do on the north side of the DMZ and Gangwon-do on the south side. There's not a whole lot of difference in geography or culture. Northern English and Southern English were always, Southern Scottish rather, were always, at odds and struggling with each other. During the Black Death, during the Edward's reign, Henry VIII, there was constant battles between England and Scotland. However, the Scottish were able to resist for various reasons, partly geographical, partly cultural, partly because France and Scotland were friends, that the Scottish resisted English invasion, and no one was able to take it over. Even the Vikings couldn't conquer the Scottish. So what ended up happening essentially is by 1707, the Scottish had tried to remain independent and started to try to trade, on the open seas, and they even tried to establish colony in the New World in Panama, which the Spanish didn't like and the English didn't support, and that failed, and Scotland essentially collapsed financially. They were out of money and they were out of options, and the English, being constantly worried about fighting France in the front and fighting Scotland in the back, made a deal that if we joined together, we would pay for all of your debt and you could join the British system, which would really, once Scotland joined and they didn't have to worry about the Scottish would contribute rather than threaten England. Scotland and England would form a partnership. A lot of Scottish people were not happy about this. They didn't want to lose their nation, their kingdom. They didn't want to lose their independence. However, the benefits were way the benefits were so advantageous. They so outweighed the disadvantages that they actually voluntarily joined the Union. It was not a conquest. It was the Scottish people deciding themselves that this was the better course. As a consequence, the Scottish became some of the best soldiers in the British military. Some of the most intelligent, some of the most enlightened, the Enlightenment, some of the greatest philosophers of history, Adam Smith, the great economist, which is in the textbook as well. We'll talk about capitalism, economists, inventors, philosophers, historians, religious, theologians. Part of this was as a result. Some people, it doesn't make sense that a country with 1 million people would be able to produce this level of intellectual development unless you take into account the fact that part of their religion was learning how to read the Bible and reading it in English, and once they read the Bible, if you were able to read the Bible, why wouldn't you be able to read Shakespeare? Or why wouldn't you be able to read translations of Aristotle or Socrates or Diogenes or any of the Greeks or Latin, the great Latin philosophers, Seneca or the Stoics, or anything. All of the literature that was available outside of the Bible suddenly became accessible. So like the proportion of inventions and intellectual accomplishments of the Scottish is not because they had bigger brains or because they had ate special food or because they had some sort of genetic advantage. It's because as a product of them learning how to read, mostly through their religious belief, mostly through exposure to the Bible, that they read all kinds of other material, and that led to innovation, and they were disproportionately. I mean, the Scottish were one of the most literate societies. There's sort of, they were more literate, they were better at reading than the English. Northern countries like Denmark and Sweden were close behind them, but as a proportion, you know, we're talking about at the same time, in the same period, some countries, 1% of the population can read, and the Scottish are approaching, you know, half the population or above being able to read. And what they read started to be relaxed. Like, you didn't just have to read the Bible, you could read all kinds of different, you could read, there is censorship, there is limitations, but you were able to read all kinds of different material. And that, and the education system, it sort of like snowballed into the Scottish being one of the most important people in the Enlightenment. The French, probably the most important group of people, but naturally they had a population that was 30 times bigger, so why not? But we're talking about Russia having a literacy rate of like 2%, and Scotland having a literacy rate of, you know, 60 or 70%. The same thing is going to happen in America. Once Americans move over there, there's going to be English and Scottish and Irish people, and America is going to become one of the most literate societies in the world, and this is going to give them a huge advantage over other countries like or empires like China or India, where a small fraction of the population can read. And it so happens that we're studying English literature, which means reading is essential and it's good for you. And this is just evidence that an entire culture and an entire group of people can develop itself and get ahead. Education in Korea is part of the reason that Korea is, you know, a developed country right now. So let's give the Scottish credit for that. There's a description about them, the rugged country, their toughness, their willingness to fight, their cultural sort of the bagpipes and the, you know, and the independence, you know, sort of resilience of their culture, just like Korea, always defending themselves against foreign invasion, and tough people, work hard, value education, and resist, you know, strong independent, value independence as a part of their culture. Ireland and Scotland, you know, do have some parallels to, I would say, the history of Korea and Korea's resistance to more powerful countries such as China and Japan and Russia and Mongolia. Likewise, the Scottish and the Irish were constantly, you know, sort of trying to resist the powerful countries that were trying to control their territory and their people. So have a look at them. They are often sort of not included in the British identity as much as they should, but certainly there's certain essential elements of Scottish culture and certain essential contributions that Scottish people have made that if they didn't and they weren't a part of the Union, the British Empire would never have existed. If that's a good thing or a bad thing, we'll have to discuss that after the midterm. Okay? Now next, Isaac Newton, one of my favorite individuals of all time. Somehow he's a religious person. I would have thought that in discovering how the world operates, that he might have lost faith in the idea that religion was important, but that's not the case. There's other brilliant people, Benjamin Franklin and Albert Einstein, who also had a strong belief in the idea that there is some supernatural being, whatever you consider it to be according to your religion, that God is, there is something beyond our understanding, which we call God. And certainly Isaac Newton believed in that. So he, when he discovered the law of gravity and he invented calculus, he really thought that he was discovering fundamental principles and rules that existed because God had organized the universe, and we were in a way just discovering how God, how things operate according to God's design. Now, if you're not religious, that's fine, and you don't believe that that's true, and that things in the world are, I mean, the universe is operating on its own without any sort of supernatural or control beyond the universe itself, or that the universe itself is what it is, and that's the fundamental reality. I'm not saying that's wrong or right. All I'm saying is that Isaac Newton was not an atheist. He had faith that what he was discovering was the operations, the sort of the ideas and the language that could express how the universe was operating according to God's plan. Okay? So he is one of the most impressive. He's the first real mathematical physics genius, I would say, in history. Mathematical physics genius. You can go back to Pythagoras and so on, but like Isaac Newton sort of it marks a point where humanity starts to realize that the operations of our universe can be determined and represented through mathematics. Calculus was invented by somebody else simultaneously, but he's a multi-talented genius on a level that rarely existed in history. You got to talk about Plato and Pythagoras and Stephen Hawking and Einstein to get close to the level of Isaac Newton. So you have to take a look at there's a short section, there's on page 123, there's a page on him. Before that is John Locke. And John Locke is a philosopher, and so is Isaac Newton. He's a philosopher too, in a different sense though, because philosophy starts to split into what will eventually become science, and what will branch out into social philosophy and continue to be like sort of fundamental philosophy, sociology. One of the things Locke was concerned about was about the human behavior as individuals and as a society. Like, how can we create a society that combines individual, what's the best way to describe this? Individual sort of development and social development at the same time. He one of his fundamental ideas was that every human being started out as sort of a blank piece of paper, like there was nothing, and that the person could be developed according to environmental influence. It's called, his theory was called the tabula rasa, and it just means that the environment, human beings are innocent, and human beings don't have, there was no genetics yet, so you can't really fault him for that, but he is wrong in a sense that there are babies do have different characteristics, and they are not blank slates. But the whole idea that the environmental influence is the most important thing in the development of a human being, he could translate to a society, meaning that if a society's environment is positive and that it nourishes and helps humans develop as a whole, and society is just and is organized, and it enables human beings to develop from a young age in a positive direction, then we can have a society that is effective. The last video that I posted, the thumbnail on the front was a picture of Oliver Cromwell, and the sort of great opposition to John Locke was Thomas Hobbes. And that's a picture from the front of his book called Leviathan, where he thinks actually the opposite, that human beings are naturally born into a condition of difficulty, and that innocence is not the fundamental basis for development. Instead, human beings exist in a sort of almost, he's anticipating in a way Darwin and evolution, where like human beings are trying to survive, and it's a struggle, and that, you know, life is nasty, brutish, and short, is one of his famous quotes. And the only way that to manage millions of human beings is to have this sort of authority and rules and regulation and restrictions and control. Otherwise, humans will return to their natural state, which is sort of like almost an animal existence, where it's, you know, animal versus animal. It's monkey versus alligator, or it's human versus human. Whoever is the strongest survives, and people are selfish, and survival is the primary goal. And if you don't have social, you know, restrictions and authority to organize groups of people, you end up with chaos. So very, very different ideas right there. Right? So ultimately, at the end of this chapter, what we end up with is finally this identity that starts to be created. It's dominated by by England and by the English and by certain things, as you mentioned. Normally, Scottish things get sort of, it's a subculture, right? So Scottish things get less representation, but what we end up with at the finally at the end of chapter 3 is this British identity that is forming around a sort of collaboration between the entire island, the entire main island of Great Britain. The Irish are a different story because they don't get integrated and they have a different religion, and they're resistant, and the sort of interaction between Great Britain and Ireland is a long and tragic, series of events. But in 1707, it would become the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, leading us into the midterm, which we will write on Thursday at 12:10 for 1 hour until 1:10. And this is the last lecture before we do that test. So please look over your tests and look over your notes and do your best. And remember, the format is 30 questions, multiple choice, and 2 longer answer questions that are worth 5 points each, for a total of 40. Good luck to all of you, and I'll see you on Thursday.